Nuclear technology has been a sensitive topic for many throughout its development, since the inception of atomic energy in the earliest 20th century to the development and deployment of nuclear weapons in the Second World War. Despite this prevalence, the majority of people won't have direct contact with uranium or nuclear technology in their lives outside seeing those iconic cooling towers of power plants. Yet, through media exposure, people can develop an inherent bias towards a certain technology based on how it's portrayed. My main goal for this is to go through my life and how I, as a nuclear engineer in study, have interacted with nuclear technology in video games. On top of the games that I grew up playing, from the late 2000s until today, I wanted to also grab a few games I'm not familiar with and see how they also portray nuclear technology. To give context, I was born on the precipice of the 21st century, so although I can't really call myself a 90s kid, I was there for a few years. We are starting this in the 1980s, and we'll be ending it in the 2020s. For each decade, I want to give 3 or 4 games, hopefully, to demonstrate what I saw, what context I was given, and hopefully by the end, the viewer here will be able to introspect with themselves and how they experience nuclear technology in video games. Within each section, I'd like to supply some contextual news coverage of events from the world that shaped public opinion. I want to begin in the 1980s with 2 games, one about nuclear energy and one about nuclear war. The first, which was released at the end of the 1970s in 1979, one event shaped the creation of this game more than any.
It was the first step in a nuclear nightmare. As far as we know at this hour, no worse than that. But a government official said that a breakdown in an atomic power plant in Pennsylvania today is probably the worst nuclear reactor accident to date.
The game in question is 3 Mile Island, the video game. Released on the Apple II by Muse Software, this is one game that I was not familiar with growing up, and I find myself struggling to call this a game. Really, it leans much more heavily into the simulation aspect and feels more like a training program with how hard it is for a new player to comprehend. Of course, as somebody who is a fan of simulation games, I can understand how this simulator can also be a game, but it just seems detached from a lot of what I and many of my peers have experienced growing up in the 2000s, and I feel the best analogy would be if anybody is familiar with Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. It feels similar trying to read and comprehend a multi-page manual under a time limit. And a lot of this game is micromanaging each section of a nuclear facility and figuring out exactly which alarm means what and which system needs changed at each individual time. The biggest issue I found with this is that when an alarm rings, you have to check it in the menu of all the pumps and pipes, valves, turbines, and figure out exactly which one it is you need to replace it with in functionality, and considering there's a long list of pumps per room, many valves, and the turbines and filters are luckily all confined to one area, it becomes a ever-increasingly difficult juggling act. Here I am currently cleaning the filters by turning off a filter and then flooding it with a water input. Each filter needs to be deactivated first, but it seems as if sometimes you can't activate a certain valve or pump based on other circumstances. In the main reactor room, the radiation is a purple cloud which escapes from the top, which seems a bit strange to me if there is no meltdown happening. But eventually, things progress worse and worse as the temperature in the reactor reaches much, much higher. The meltdown commences, and you are given a feed of the containment vessel leaking down into the Earth as the core just melts the containment vessel that it's in. The screen continues to flash until the program is reset. I was not alone in thinking about the very detached nature of the controls. From Space Gamer issue 34, Bruce F. Webster says that the only real weak point in 3 Mile Island is the documentation. It's laid out more in the form of a reference manual than a user's guide, and the critical information you need to run the plant effectively is hard to dig out. As somebody coming into this for the first time, I'm glad that my struggle was not mine alone, and that even at the time, people also had difficulties grasping the long manual and every single small piece of operating information that is buried within. There was a second game released called Scram on the Atari 400 and 800 in 1981. Unfortunately, I could not get Scram to emulate properly, but it followed the same basic idea of running a reactor and preventing a meltdown. There was a developer interview with Chris Crawford, and this is that interview.
A nuclear power plant is a very dynamic thing, and I wanted something that would show them the functioning of it, how all the pieces fit together, because it is a complex machine that is highly interactive, and that's what I wanted to get across.
Moving along from TMI and Scram is a classic arcade game, Missile Command. Released originally for arcades in June of 1980, this game takes the idea of a Cold War gone hot and puts the player in the seat to prevent ICBMs from destroying cities. This is the first game of many on this list that I have played when I was younger. Despite not growing up in the arcade era, I had played Missile Command on arcade collections for the PlayStation 2. Contrary to many games that will come after this, Missile Command does not place the player as the attacker in a nuclear war scenario. This game is purely about protecting and defending the land in which the player is placed into. Given that there are no discernible nations in this game, it is up to the player to imagine what country they are defending. Although the Cuban Missile Crisis at this point was 2 decades prior, the threat of nuclear annihilation had not subsided from public conscience. The game predates the nuclear buildup of the early 80s in Europe and the near disaster of the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm, but comes shortly after the end of the Vietnam War and captured what could have happened given that someone launched the first nuke, and that sentiment that continued to haunt the developers. There is a book known as Blue Wizard is About to Die, prose, poems, and emoto-versatronic expressionist pieces about video games. In this collection of video game-inspired literature pieces is a poem about Missile Command. It is a great irony that a child tortured by fears of nuclear holocaust should take such delight in a game that gave its own programmer nightmares of the apocalypse, the mushroom cloud rising as a splash of red pixels, the dream maker tortured by his own creations. There are several other games in this era that deal with the same sort of messages as Missile Command, such as 1981's B-1 Nuclear Bomber by Microcomputer Games, 1983's Apocalypse from Games Workshop, 1984's War Games by Colco and Raid Over Moscow by Access Software, 1985's Balance of Power by Chris Crawford, who also developed Scram, and 1986's Trinity by Infocom. All of these games came out in the early 80s, too soon to be influenced by the event of this decade that everyone is aware of.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died. The Soviets may have been fairly quick to acknowledge the accident because evidence in the form of mild nuclear radiation had already reached beyond the Soviet borders to Scandinavia. We begin with ABC's Dean Ross.
It is believed serious, but details of damage, injuries, or casualties are few so far.
The Soviet Union, as a subject of international and geopolitical reality, no longer exists.
Tonight, the red flag was taken down from the Kremlin, where it has flown since the 1917 revolution. The Soviet Union it symbolized is now dead. In its place, they raised the flag of Boris Yeltsin's Russia.
But it's not that simple. Some of the remaining Soviet republics prefer Gorbachev and his ideas to the new Commonwealth, whose members already have disagreements on how quickly to change to a free market system, for example, and on whether to destroy the nuclear weapons on their soil or keep them.
As the specter of Chernobyl loomed over Europe into the 1990s, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall led to the 1990s not seeing the same variety of games about nuclear power and nuclear war as the 80s did. With the Cold War over and nuclear disaster still fresh in the mind, developers pivoted as home consoles grew in popularity to more family or action-oriented games rather than simulations. But one event would shape the next decade and would propel nuclear war back into the public mind.
CNN's coverage of the war in the Gulf continues. I'm Catherine Cryer at the CNN Center in Atlanta.
And I'm Bernard Shaw in Washington. Iraq launched 2 Scud missile attacks on Saudi Arabia within the last 12 hours.
The other important thing is to knock out the missile launch capability that could threaten other countries, our troops in Saudi Arabia, Israel, and other countries. That's extremely important, and also knocking out the chemical, nuclear, and biological warfare capability.
During the 1990s, a new genre was taking shape outside the typical action games of Quake and Wolfenstein, or platformers such as Mario and Sonic. This genre was the real-time strategy game. There are several games at the beginning of the RTS genre that could be mentioned as starting and propelling it into popularity, but the most prevalent to our world, and the world that still hadn't cooled from the Cold War, is Command & Conquer. The original Command & Conquer was developed in 1995 and has been given the retronym of Tiberium Dawn. The sequel game, Red Alert, was more or less a reskin of Tiberium Dawn, except set in an alternate history setting. The focus of these games, and future games mentioned in this list, are on the player taking a bird's-eye view of factions dueling for conquest of the world. Although the first 2 games only sparsely feature nuclear technology in the form of 2 different styles of nuclear missile silo and no fallout from nuclear explosions, later iterations would expand upon nuclear technology in unsuspecting ways.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very well.
Continuing into the 2000s, the first game in this era is Red Alert 2. Here, both factions still receive a standard, albeit sci-fi-looking, basic power plant, but the Soviets have access to an advanced power generation building known simply as the nuclear reactor. Unlike their basic Tesla reactor, the nuclear reactor produces far more power, but can suffer a catastrophic meltdown if it reaches 0 hit points. This results in an area fallout, much like if the nuclear missile is used. The Soviets also maintain their missile silo with a new design. Here the nuclear missile was used to destroy Chicago during the 4th mission of one of the in-game campaigns.
Commander, they never saw us coming. That was splendid.
Hear me.
you foul American phantom, wherever you are. You can work your armies like a puppeteer all you want, but this is my play. Here is the city that you have saved. Behold the power of Mother Russia!
Mission accomplished.
Although the Gulf War only lasted 6 months, moving into the early 2000s, a far more serious and devastating conflict would erupt in the Middle East.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The president connected with the top Democrat in the Senate at about 9 o'clock last night, Tom Daschle. They've both said they give him unconditionally their support in this action. And as you know, Aaron, it was about 3 days, it was exactly 3 days after the attacks of September 11th that the Congress passed a resolution authorizing the use of all necessary and appropriate force against...
And Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld announces the shooting war against terrorism is on.
The only way to deal with these terrorist threats is to go at them where they exist.
This leads up to 2003's Command & Conquer Generals, a departure from the alternate and sci-fi versions of Command & Conquer. This takes the series for the only time to a modern and familiar world and places the player in the leading role of commanders during an alternate war on terror. In this game, the United States does not have access to nuclear weapons, but does still have one piece of nuclear technology, the cold fusion reactor. The United States in Generals is portrayed as having advanced technologies such as particle weapons and advanced laser weaponry, so the cold fusion being more advanced than the nuclear reactors of the Chinese is a strange inclusion. Cold fusion was and still is a hypothetical technology. Suspending the disbelief of cold fusion being deemed unfeasible, the cold fusion reactor produces less power than a nuclear reactor, but can be upgraded with control rods, despite the fact that fusion reactors don't need control rods, and they cannot undergo a nuclear meltdown if destroyed. Meanwhile, the Chinese reactors mirror the Soviet reactor from Red Alert 2, except with a much less devastating nuclear meltdown. With the expansion for Generals, known as Zero Hour, the nuclear technology in this game is given even further representation, with advanced cold fusion reactors and advanced nuclear reactors for China and the United States. While these buildings are scaled down for gameplay purposes, in the Chinese campaign, there is a full-scale nuclear reactor that needs to be defended. We've gone from neither faction having nuclear power generation, although Nod has a nuclear missile in the original Command & Conquer, to only the Soviets having the nuclear reactor. Now, in Generals, 2 of the 3 factions have nuclear power generation. But nuclear generation is not the only thing that has been expanded in Generals. And as seen from the original Red Alert and Red Alert 2, it's not a Command & Conquer game without nuclear weapons.
Our nuclear missile is ready, General.
Iconic at this point, the superweapon of the Chinese is the nuclear missile, but they are not limited to just the nuclear missile. Chinese tanks can be upgraded with nuclear shells and a movement speed increase from what I can only assume is a nuclear power generator on board the tank. If a tank is destroyed without a special upgrade known as isotope stabilization, a micro meltdown will occur and damage things around the tank. China is also afforded the nuke cannon, which is based on the 1960s experiments of nuclear artillery and tactical nukes. Speaking of tactical nuclear capabilities, the Chinese MiG, which is their main air unit, can be upgraded with small nuclear warheads if playing as the Chinese nuke general. The nuke cannon can also be upgraded with neutron shells, which destroy occupants of vehicles without destroying the vehicle itself. This game, with its wide representation of nuclear technology, would not be matched by later Command & Conquer games, and the collaboration between the United States and China in this game would also not return.
Be careful, she's fragile.
We've spent a lot of time with strategy games in the 90s and early 2000s, but now I'd like to shift to an entirely different genre that blossomed since the late 1990s, and that is the city builder. 2003's SimCity 4, released by Maxis, this game is self-explanatory about creating a city and a region of cities, where the player, as the mayor, must cater to the needs of the citizens, or Sims, who live within your jurisdiction. The game has a relatively slow start, but as the population and industry grow, more buildings and opportunities to grow the city are given to the player. Of note are 5 specific buildings: the nuclear power plant, the hydrogen power plant, the disease research center, and the advanced research center. For the nuclear power plant, its cost per megawatt hour places it between that of natural gas and oil, but produces the second most power in the game, only behind the hydrogen power plant. The nuclear plant is alone in the consequences of aging, as it creates the largest detonation of any power plant failure and is the only power plant to leave radiation when failing. The building also produces protesters that remain outside unless the nuclear free zone ordinance is enacted, which also destroys any nuclear power plants that are currently within the city. The nuclear power plant also reduces the land value nearby, and given its zero pollution while operating, still becomes more undesirable than a coal power plant, which feels very backwards given hindsight. Moving along from the explosion and apparent hatred of nuclear power is the hydrogen power plant. This is the most expensive and most powerful generator in the game, and does not produce radiation when failing. It's hard to classify this as nuclear technology to me because it isn't directly stated that it is. But given that it's hydrogen power, I assume it's a fusion reactor, and the interior of the structure looks like what appears to be an inertial confinement chamber. Regardless, it stands much more beloved by citizens in this game than nuclear energy does, despite not yet being developed even 20 years later. This is a much more realistic power generation method than the cold fusion of the United States in generals. As for the research centers, the Advanced Research Center is what I can assume a particle accelerator or some other national laboratory type research campus, which has very trace amounts of radiation experiments. Following the Advanced Research Center is the Disease Research Center, which also leaves behind a small amount of radiation. This building acts as the highest capacity hospital with the largest radius in the entire game, and stands alone in all of the nuclear technology that I observed, in one of the only pieces of nuclear medicine that is even slightly referenced. Nuclear power and nuclear war are always at the forefront of people's attention given world events, but radiotherapy and using radioisotopes as trackers for cancer are hardly ever mentioned. One of the unfortunate limitations of the game is when radiation is no longer being produced, it takes over 10,000 years for it to fully dissipate. It would have been very nice to have some way of doing radioactive cleanup. Moving back to nuclear war again, 2007's DEF CON, developed by Introversion Software, returns to something that resembles Missile Command over 20 years later. This game places the player in control of a region of the Earth. They place down units, and slowly the DEFCON of the game reduces, and as each DEFCON level lowers, more and more options are available to a player, until eventually all-out nuclear war. DEFCON has been described as feeling much more like a horror game than a strategy game. With the inevitability of nuclear war looming overhead as battles progress and as the DEFCON level decreases, I find myself in complete agreement to the assessment. If Missile Command gave its developers nightmares, I can't imagine what they would feel about this one.
Good evening, everyone. Right about now, people here in Japan are starting to ask themselves, how much worse can it get? Struck yesterday by one of the largest earthquakes ever on record. Entire communities swept away under a 30-foot high tsunami, and now this. Thousands forced to flee from the path of a radioactive leak. It's Sunday morning here in Tokyo, which, though far from...
complex came to grips with a grim reality today. Officials admitted 7 damaged reactors are teetering on the edge of a possible meltdown. The complex is broken into 2 sections, Daini with 4 faulty reactors and Daiichi with 3 damaged reactors out of 6.
Japanese engineers marshaled all their remaining tools today in the week-long struggle to prevent a full-blown nuclear disaster. And in Washington, President Obama sought to reassure Americans about the potential for radiation to drift over the U.S.
We do not expect harmful levels of radiation to reach the West Coast, Hawaii, Alaska, or U.S. territories in the Pacific.
On the scale of nuclear events, Fukushima matched that of Chernobyl, far worse than that of 3 Mile Island in the 70s. It's important to note that Fukushima's cleanup has been progressing recently and land reclamation is in progress for the areas surrounding the disaster. While the immediate response was to close all reactors in Japan, many nuclear reactors have resumed operation by the 2020s. Starting the 2010s with the 2010 release of Civilization V by Firaxis, which predates the Fukushima accident, Civilization V is a turn-based strategy game in which the player must navigate through the ages from 4000 BC to the modern and even the future era and lead their civilization to victory. Given that it has modern-day elements, nuclear power does appear in the form of a nuclear power plant, which provides production bonuses on par with that of a solar power plant, but does not need to be built in a desert like a solar power plant. Uranium in the game can also be used to build nuclear weapons, starting with the atomic bomb on the development of nuclear fission, and the nuclear missile on the development of advanced ballistics. Using nuclear weapons leaves clouds of fallout and destroys much of the population unless a bunker is constructed. Given that fallout and pollution exist in the game, I find it is a missed opportunity to have a mechanic in which a reactor can melt down due to unrest and unhappiness, which has appeared in other iterations of the game before and after. Interestingly enough, the so aptly named nuclear submarine does not require uranium to build like some other units do, although it can carry nuclear ballistic missiles like those of the real world. I find it a strange omission that the nuclear submarine does not require that kind of power. Speaking of units requiring uranium to be built, outside the atomic bomb and nuclear missile is the one piece of future technology, the giant death robot, which is the most powerful land unit in the entire game. This requires 2 uranium to build and borders more on science fiction at this point. Moving into the mid-2010s, I'd like to now pivot to a rarer representation of nuclear technologies, and for that, a rocket is required. 2015's Kerbal Space Program, originally developed by Squad, follows the player on their journey to run a space agency. While many technologies in this game include liquid and solid fuel rockets and air-breathing engines, there is one very special engine called the NERV nuclear engine. This engine is much lower power than the traditional propulsion engines, but is extremely fuel efficient and does not require an oxidizer. This makes it very well suited for long-distance missions. On top of that, one of the power generation methods outside of solar is the use of radiothermic generators, or RTGs. While they have limited terrestrial use outside remote locations such as Arctic lighthouses, these technologies are well suited for long-distance space journeys as they can passively provide at least a small amount of power. Understandably, nuclear space propulsion and radiothermic generation wouldn't naturally appear in most games, as they have limited use on Earth, but it's unique to see both a failed project, the NERVA engine, and radiothermic generators appear in a video game. Remaining in space for a brief moment is 2019's Space Engineers by Keen Software. This game portrays nuclear space propulsion as well, somewhat. The main power generation method is through the use of nuclear reactors, which use uranium, and a prototype fusion reactor, which uses hydrogen. In space, the most powerful engines are hydrogen-based chemical rockets, but the choice for fuelless ion engines is also available. Given that the ion engines only require an electric charge, one can assume they use the reactor to charge a gas much like that of the ion engine from Kerbal Space Program. In recent memory, NASA announced plans for SF-1, a space reactor being a nuclear ion engine, and it's safe to assume that this is how the Space Engineers reactors operate, if a reactor is on board. If not, then one can assume that the reactor works the same as NS Savannah or on a terrestrial aircraft carrier. Nuclear power turning a turbine that powers engines. A more recent addition to Space Engineers is environmental hazards such as radiation exposure. One form of radiation exposure is if a nuclear reactor takes damage, it will begin to leak radiation, and this exposure continues to rise until it begins to do damage. Unfortunately, in this creative world, damage is off, but you can see the exposure meter rising as I stand next to these leaking reactors. We arrive at the present day, a decade removed from Fukushima and over 40 years removed from where we started at 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. The decade is still ongoing, but several events have already happened that have once again brought nuclear into the public mind.
Russia has attacked Ukraine, marking
Meantime,
the
in
start
northern
of
Ukraine,
a
the
new
site
war
of the
in
world's
Eastern
worst nuclear disaster has been captured by Russian
shelter
forces.
On the Chernobyl nuclear power plant site was damaged by Russian drones, according
the destruction
to
of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity. And
tonight with the escalating battle over one of the world's most vital shipping channels. The U.S. and Iran trading new threats around the Strait of Hormuz, sending gas prices skyrocketing
unprecedented speed.
Today, half of our electricity comes from renewables. And if you look at the low carbon energy, so nuclear and renewables, it's 74%.
The 2020s have begun and continue to be a decade of lessons forgotten and lessons repeated. The modern world seems to be more and more unstable, but nuclear power is seen much more positively being so removed from the disasters of the past. The first modern game on the list is Woob's Factorio. Factorio is a resource management and factory building game about trying to escape the planet that you've crash-landed on, and with the expansion pack, escaping the entire solar system. Considering how much nuclear technology that's been looked at so far today, this is probably the most in-depth. Uranium is mined and sent to centrifuges to be enriched. The probability of receiving different uranium isotopes matches the natural abundance of those isotopes on Earth. You need a set amount of uranium-238 to create a fuel cell for nuclear power plants, but can use U-235 to enrich it with a certain ratio. Nuclear fuel is inserted into nuclear reactors, and these generate heat. The heat is transferred through heat pipes to heat exchangers, which boil water and generate power through steam turbines. This entire nuclear power plant, step by step, is much more complex than that of city builders, as they are not one building and a series of interconnected parts. Nuclear fuel is inserted into the reactors and is used at a constant rate until it becomes depleted. Depleted fuel cells can then be placed into a centrifuge to get U-235 back, and that can be used in enrichment once again, although not all of the fuel is maintained. Out of every game looked at so far, the only game that has nuclear fuel reprocessing as a mechanic is something from the current day. Nuclear reactors in Factorio mirror that of SimCity 4. If a nuclear reactor takes critical damage above a heat threshold, then a nuclear chain reaction will commence. Given that nuclear reactors need to be placed next to each other, a chain of nuclear detonations of multiple reactors is basically guaranteed. Given that there are hostile aliens in Factorio, one can imagine that you can't have a game with nuclear power without nuclear weapons. The most relevant is the atomic bomb, which is a missile. The atomic bomb detonates in a large radius and deals massive damage to enemy bases. With the expansion Space Age, fusion is added. Fusion power does not experience catastrophic meltdown like nuclear power does when receiving damage. And also, fusion fuel is only used as required and, unlike uranium, is not burned at a constant rate. The only thing required for fusion power is the fusion fuel cell, which does not get depleted and simply vanishes and cannot be reprocessed, and a coolant, which is recycled in a 1-to-1 ratio, so once coolant is put in, does not need to be resupplied. One interesting point to make about fusion power plants and fusion generators in Factorio is that unlike the steam generators of the early game and the nuclear power plants of the late game, fusion generators are a direct conversion method of power generation and don't just boil water to create steam. Moving back to nuclear war, very briefly, is 2023's Nuclear Option, developed by Shockfront Studios. This is a simulator/arcade flight game about a regional conflict where the player takes the role of a pilot for one of two factions. As the conflict escalates, access to tactical and strategic nuclear weapons is made available. Although many of the games that have been looked at let the player pull the trigger on deploying a nuclear bomb, this game places the player directly in the delivery vehicle, and if the player is too close to the blast, the plane is destroyed by the shockwave. The bombs in nuclear option range from 1.5 kilotons up to 250 kilotons, and the true devastation is on full display. The final game I want to talk on in this brief retrospective of nuclear games I've experienced is 2023's Nucleaires, developed by a single developer, Ivan Marcello Preti. This places the player in charge of running a simplified nuclear reactor. This brings the entire video full circle, starting with running a nuclear reactor and ending with running a nuclear reactor. The nuclear reactor in Nucleaires must be monitored for faults and must be run in the optimal operating ranges. Entire steam loops, water loops, valves, and everything is modeled just like 3 Mile Island. The city in which you supply power also has a changing demand, so the reactor needs to be ramped up or ramped down depending on the demand. Each part can wear and eventually break and needs to be maintained. So, how's the future looking? What events will shape the 2030s and what new games will come out? There's new city builders, such as City Skylines 2, space sandbox games like Space Engineers 2. There was the unfortunate early demise of Kerbal Space Program 2, means that nuclear space propulsion will probably have to wait for something such as Kitten Space Agency, and there are plenty of new war games to be released in the future. There is a new game on Steam that has no release date known as Nuclear Design Bureau, and that seems fascinating. And while not my area of expertise, are there any medical games that use MRI machines or radioactive tracers to diagnose medical issues? The world is open to developers to make players experience nuclear technologies through many different aspects. So now, my concluding thoughts. There were plenty of issues with this project that could have been rectified with more time to think and process more games. Scope creep kept getting in my way and ballooned what I wanted to cover. There were more games I didn't grow up with playing that I wanted to add, such as Fallout and Stalker, or even mod packs for things like Minecraft or the more advanced processing chains in Factorio mods. But I hope that this brief retrospective was informative on how players have interacted with nuclear technologies and makes you wonder all the ways that you, the viewer, have. With that said, I did survey several people about how they felt about nuclear technologies, and the common sentiment among people who are in my social circles, who are almost all engineers. First, I asked how they felt about nuclear technologies as a whole, and the responses were very heartwarming to me. 91.6% of respondents felt at least somewhat positively about nuclear technologies before even opening the survey, while only 5.6% felt somewhat negatively. A few reasons that people responded this way were answered in a follow-up question. They said that nuclear energy is clean and reliable. Many people pointed out the energy efficiency of nuclear power, which is well observed in the games that have been spoken about. Many people found that despite nuclear weapons existing, that nuclear technologies is a net positive for humanity. While many people felt that video games themselves did not shape their opinion on nuclear technology, noteworthy is the 22.2% of respondents that felt that it shaped it positively, and the 13.9% that found it influenced them negatively. The reasons for this are that many were already pro-nuclear before playing or considering how games influenced them on nuclear technology, or that games tend to be singularly focused on the destructive nature. One key point was that they don't really focus on the nuclear aspect in the forefront, and it exists merely in the background. The companion to that question is asking how nuclear technologies are represented in video games, more positively or negatively, and this is a very vast contrast to how people actually perceive nuclear technology, with 80.5% feeling that it is more negatively portrayed, while only 8.4% felt that it was positively portrayed. Some examples of why this stark contrast is observed were they are a plot device to cause some disaster, and that they concentrate on the consequences of nuclear weapons. There were some points about how nuclear technology is used to clearly define who the villain of the story is through nuclear proliferation or through access that was stolen to nuclear weapons. Finally, I wanted to ask if and how events outside video games shaped people's opinion on nuclear technology. Here, 72.2% of respondents felt that events outside video games shaped their opinion positively, while 11.1% found events to have affected them somewhat negatively. The people interviewed were not isolated to my own experiences in the Midwest, and so a few anecdotes of why people formed the opinion that they did are as follows. Some did self-research on YouTube about how nuclear power actually works and how safe it really is. The Iran war showing just how fragile fossil fuels are and how with nuclear technology prices would be much more stable. Several mentioned their families being directly affected by Chernobyl and living in Eastern Europe. The Russo-Ukrainian war was another point on how energy independence is essential. A few felt that Germany was too conservative with shutting down their reactors in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. Comparing the games I grew up with those of my friends and colleagues highlighted the vast difference in the media landscape that we all grew up in. There are many games I wish I could have covered in this, and that I could have experienced growing up, but just did not have the time. Here's a list of the ones that people responded in the survey with, and if you've ever played these games or want to play them, then I implore you to give them a shot, and do let me know in the comments how you feel once you finish going through them. I find people sharing their experiences is how we grow as a society. To conclude, the links to where to get every game that is purchasable is in the description, the sources of all the books and articles referenced, as well as the news coverage broadcast links. It's been a while since I've done a scripted video like this, and I can only think back to my old War Thunder reviews of many years ago. I hope that this video makes you think about how media, video games or otherwise, have shaped your opinion on technology that you may have never been able to experience yourself, and gives you a better understanding on how it works. With that, thank you for watching.